Thank you very much, Dr. Green, and a warm welcome to everyone. I'm Hayley Channer. I'm the Director of Economic Security with the US Studies Centre, and I'm going to now moderate Session 2. Session 2 is on economic security strategies in practice. Who is doing what? And it's my very great pleasure to introduce to the stage Dr. Kazuto Suzuki. Dr. Suzuki is both Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo and Director and Group Head of the Institute of Geoeconomics, which is a private think tank based at the International House of Japan. Now, Japan has faced economic coercion for a very long time, much longer than a decade, and Dr. Suzuki is widely considered one of the world's leading thinkers on geoeconomics. So we are really fortunate to have him with us this morning to explain this challenging new world to us. Can I invite Dr. Suzuki to the podium to give some introductory remarks for about 15 minutes, and then we will have a panel discussion following that. Dr. Suzuki.
Thank you, Haley.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored and pleasure to be on this podium. I thank the Center for the United States Study Center and also a lot of person involved in this organizing this symposium. And I think it's a great pleasure to have this sort of a session or the conference dedicated for the economic security, because 2 years ago, when people talk about the economic security, people are thinking, what? Security and economics? It doesn't go together. So I think, ever since, Japan has been engaged in economic security issue, and the Mike has already said that Japan was a thought leader. And Haley just introduced me as a leading thinker. And so it means that I'm the leading thinker in the world, but but actually, it's not. I am just working as director of the Institute of Geoeconomics, which is a newly established think tank, only to work on mainly on the Japanese issues, but also the global geoeconomics issue. And I think the word geoeconomics is also a new invention in Japan. Well, of course, the word existed for many years, but I think it is now being focused in a lot of sense. So this session is about the strategy of the economic security. Well, since the definition of economic security is still ambivalent, not so fixed, so I think each country has interpreted the idea of economic security in various ways. And therefore, the strategy of the states are all different. So I think I'm not going to do the sort of a comparing notes and describe everything about everything about economic security in all countries, but I'm just trying to focus on the Japan. So as you know, Japan has established what we call ESPA, the Economic Security Promotion Act, in 2022, and this has set up the minister for the economic security, who is currently who is Minister Takaichi at this moment. But this is considered as a big thing in internationally, and I think it's true that Japan has set up the legal framework for implementing the economic security methods. But this is part of the entire strategy of the Japanese economic security. When we talk about strategy, and I think there are many experts on this in this room, when we talk about strategy, we need to think about what are the threats, so what we are protecting from, and how we protect our interests and our values, and also what are the objectives of these strategies. So the threats are basically China. from Japan, I mean, Japan has a long history of trading with China, and for thousands of years that Japan, has been a neighbor of China. So we cannot move geographically, so therefore we need to deal with China. But the issue of economic security arose in the incident took place in 2010 when China has put economic coercion against Japan to release the captain of the fishing boat, which collided with the Japanese Coast Guard vessel around the Senkaku Island, which is a disputed territory, by the way. This incident has been a wake-up call for Japan, and it has to be we have to do something in order to avoid the China using economy as a coercive measures. And that was the time that China stopped exporting the rare earth mineral, and Japan depends on China 90% of the rare earth mineral. So it was a very significant impact on the Japanese automobile industry, and it had a significant impact politically for the way in which that we deal with China. So the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI, has launched an initiative which are very small, about 1,600, well, it was 160 billion yen, which is about $1 billion US dollars around that time. So it was a very small project to diversify the supply chain, and which didn't fly. I mean, most of the companies preferred to stay in China and didn't want to diversify the course of procurement, so that this policy didn't fly well. But the COVID has changed the perception of the diversification of the supply chain. The masks, PPE, and many other items which were not being able to procure from China, and that has raised some social and economic uncertainties and discontent. So I think this was a time that the people start to realize that we need to do seriously about the using economy in looking at an economy in a different way. However, these threats were not just simply coming from China, and it is coming from United States. And it is kind of weird for us to think that this is a security problem and the threat coming from United States. But the US policy has shifted towards more protectionist measures, and that has a significant impact because Japan is the number one investor in United States, and especially in the case of the Nippon Steel's acquisition of the U.S. Steel has been concerning for the Japanese business mind that the United States is using the security framework to coerce Japan or to reject Japan or whatever you call it. There is a significant political implication in Japan. So these are also considered as a part of threats, different kinds of threats from China, of course, but that is also being regarded as a disruption of the mechanisms. And the method, how to protect and how to proceed our strategy is that, well, I'm not going to discuss about the details of ESPA, but the traditional export control is no longer enough to prevent these kind of economic coercion. So the ESPA strengthening the supply chain resilience and also protecting the infrastructure from being intruded by the foreign forces. And also one of the important things is to increase the investment on the science and technology for the dual-use technology. since perhaps you may all know that Japan, since 2022, when we published the new national security strategy, the Japanese defense posture has changed, and one of which is to invest a lot in the defense-related technology, and the increasing of the defense budget doubling to the 2027 is one of the part of this this part. So Japan has identified the 12 items for the supply chain resilience, including the semiconductor and the critical mineral, and even the cloud services, which is dominated by the American companies. So the 12 items as the strategically important items, so that these need to be reducing the dependence on the other countries. And we are also identifying the 20 different technological areas, including space, quantum computing, cybersecurity, etc., and focusing these 20 different technological sectors as the targeting sector for the R&D. One of the interesting methods of the Japanese promotion of the economic security is that I think the previous panel has discussed about the relationship between the government and industry. The Japanese government, especially the METI, has established a new framework called the Private Partner Consultation Group, which is to promote the strategic dialogue between the private industry and the Japanese government. And one of the part of this process is the establishment of the security clearance system. The security clearance is, of course, as you know, that to share the information, the classified information with the non-governmental officials, and I think this security clearance system will be used for the fostering the strategic dialogue with the industry, and to share the certain intelligence information to understand why we need to control these items and why we need to invest in this technological area. So this sort of dialogue is creating the new discipline of the relationship between Japan and Japanese government and industry. Perhaps you may recall Japan has been the champion of the industrial policy. But since 1980s, the United States has, Japan and the United States has a serious trade friction, and ever since Japan has tried to reduce the amount of the government intervention in the market and try to foster the sort of a market-oriented economy. And eventually now people are talking about the industrial policy, and Japan is left out from the industrial policy. So now we are behind everyone else. So we are now thinking about how to manage or how to balance the relationship between the industrial policy and the free trade agreement, free trade principles. Japan has been a champion of the free trade arrangement, especially after the Trump administration left TPP. The Prime Minister Abe has put up all the pieces together and created CPTPP. So Japan has been promoting and playing as a leader of the free trade arrangement in this region, but at the same time there is a demand for the further investment and industrial policy. So in this regard, Japan has taken the small yard high fence seriously. And this is one of the reasons why the ESPA, the Economic Security Promotion Act, has limited to the items that is on the legal document, that these are 12 items that we are focusing on. The rest assure that the other items will be remained in the free trade. The 20 different 20 technological sectors are the principal target sector, but the other sectors will live in the hands of the invisible hand of God, and to let the market take place. So basically, we are trying to find the sort of draw a line between what needs to be controlled and what not to be controlled, so that we try to. I think we need to, and there is a lot of promotions for the further free trade. So there's a negotiation between the Japan and the Mercosur countries and elsewhere. There are still very much engagement for the Japanese to work on the free trade principles. Finally, the objectives. We are searching for the strategic autonomy, but we realize that we cannot achieve the strategic autonomy by onshoring everything, homeshoring everything, because Japan still depends on the energy and the food and everything else. So Japan, again, maintaining the free trade while trying to achieve the strategic autonomy, which leads to the friendshoring. And Australia is the best partner for the friendshoring for the food and energy. Japan imports the LNG from Australia the most, and this is kind of a approach that we are taking. And also, there is another objective is strategic indispensability. The strategic indispensability, Japan has certain technological advantages and being as an indispensable part of the global market, but we need to strengthen that, and this is part of the objective of the ESPA to focus on the R&D on the scientific and dual-use technology. And I think these objectives can be shared with other countries, and I think this forum will provide the opportunity to think and to discuss about how can we share the same objective, and how can we learn each other for the methods of achieving those objectives. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Dr. Suzuki. And I think you're right. Geography, a bit like demography, can be destiny. But the whole point of this conference is to work together to influence something we can change, which is the future and the future of our respective policies. So with that, can I please invite to the stage our other panel members, Dr. Yunjong Wong and Mr. Jonathan Fritz, and we will commence. Okay, so as we know, economic security means different things in different contexts, and this is especially true regarding how different countries view economic security in a turbulent world. In this session, our goal is to dig deeper into different national strategies. So we have perspectives from Japan, Korea, and the United States, and we have a very distinguished group of speakers to help us understand how these three different countries view economic security. I should also note, later in the day, we're going to hear a European perspective. It's just not a good time of day for Europeans right now. So we'll be hearing from Mr. Denis Redonnet, who is the Deputy Director General for Trade in the European Commission, for a European perspective. Now, I've already introduced Dr. Suzuki. As for our other panellists, firstly, Dr. Yunjong Wong. Dr. Wong commenced as Deputy National Security Advisor for Economic and Cybersecurity in the Office of the President of the Republic of Korea earlier this year. Previously, he served as Secretary to the President for Economic Security within the Office of the President of the Republic of Korea. And our panellist on the end from the United States is Mr. Jonathan Fritz. Mr. Fritz works for the US Department of State as the Chief of Staff to the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy and Environment. Previously, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs with responsibility for China, Mongolia, and Taiwan. So what I want to do now is, we've heard a Japanese perspective which included things like geography, access to critical materials, and some of the changing policies of the United States, for instance. Can I turn to you, Dr. Wong, first for a Korean perspective? How is Korea viewing this issue of economic security, and what do you think has changed in recent years to give economic security such huge prominence?
I think our Korean strategy is very similar to the, the U.S. and Japan and other, the European countries. Basically, we are focusing on the 3 Ps, the promotion and protection and partnership. So when it comes to promotion, I think we have to, strengthen the supply chain resilience. And then for that purpose, we are domestically and also internationally trying to secure those kind of supply chain, particularly in the minerals and the raw materials. And the other one is protection. Protection is about the protection of the high-tech skill. And so we have some the technology cooperation with Japan and the United States, particularly in the critical and emerging technology. So including the quantum and the artificial intelligence and the chips and advanced chips. So those the protection area is also very important. And finally, the partnership. So now we are just searching for the partnership bilaterally and trilaterally and multilaterally. So one of the important progress is multilateral, the setting, particularly in the Indo-Pacific countries. So 14 countries just finished some, the 3 pillars, except for trade pillars. Trade pillar is still ongoing, but I think those kind of promotion and protection and the partnership is very, very essential for having a very alliance for the economic security. That is basically our Korea strategy.
Yes, I like the 3P approach. It's a good way to think of things. Yeah. Can I also just give a follow-up question, which is, if you were to explain how similarly and differently Korea looks at economic security compared to, say, the United States, Japan, or Australia, do you see more similarities or more differences in terms of how we understand this as a concept?
Always, we are trying to coordinate our interest. So individual countries have a different interest and different stakes. So I think when you just started a bilateral dialogue with the United States, and my partner is Charan Chabra in the NSC, then we just had a lot of the agendas, particularly about the semiconductor was one of the important area. So and then we just exchanged different views on the issue. But every time we had a meeting, we have some the differences, but to try to harmonize the the different interests, and then we just finally reached some conclusion. And last year, early last year, we just launched a trilateral meeting with by inviting Japan. And Japan already had the bilateral the dialogue with the United States, so that we just merged together to have a trilateral meeting. Then we just opened a lot of the issues individually. Korea just bring up some of the issues, particularly the ILA issue is very, very critical to the Korea's EV industry and the automobile sector and the battery sector. So how to secure the raw materials for the purpose of the ILA. So that was we try to coordinate the issues together.
Yes, I think many people would understand that our countries are like-minded, but that doesn't mean that there aren't differences. Jonathan, can I turn to you for a United States perspective? The IRA has been mentioned, and obviously the last 18 months has seen some really big changes in the United States policy around economic security. Could you give a perspective from America on this issue?
Sure. Thanks, Haley. I guess I want to start off by saying what we're not trying to do. And we are not seeking to decouple the U.S. and PRC economies. Despite all of the atmospherics, bilateral trade is still north of $500 billion a year, generating benefits for consumers, companies, workers, and farmers on both sides of the Pacific. So that, I think, is important to keep in mind as we discuss economic security. And I'm going to keep this focused on China. We could talk, obviously, about pandemics, Russia, and a bunch of other topics, but I'm going to keep this focused mostly on the China vector. We do take very seriously Xi Jinping's quest to obtain technological superiority over the democratic West. and dominance of what he views as strategic global economic supply chains. And so, we are compelled, of course, to take measures to prevent him from achieving those goals. As has been mentioned by several of the folks who have spoken already, we are trying to adopt this small yard, high fence model. But of course, the PRC is a massive economy. They're a very dynamic competitor. And they have a vast whole of society toolbox that is not constrained by democratic checks and balances. So more out of sorrow than anger, I think we recognize that the size of the garden is not just for us to determine. The PRC gets a vote. And so we have to be able to adapt and respond to threats as they come up. Echoing again many of the comments that have already preceded, I think we kind of view economic security in sort of three large buckets. The first is the one that Alan talked about, sort of the traditional national security bucket, if you will. And here we're talking about anything that would give the PRC access to cutting edge technologies that it would use to make more lethal its the PLA's arsenal, or to further enhance the capability of its security and intelligence services to do their thing. We're not fans of any of that. And here, of course, the tools are it's controls, it's restrictions. We've already talked about export controls and how those have been strengthened considerably over the last number of years. CFIUS has already been mentioned. We're now also, of course, considering rules on outbound investment. Those are not ready just yet, but we are looking to impose requirements that we would need requirements for both notifications and occasionally even prohibitions on outbound investment into particular PRC sectors like AI, quantum, and microelectronics. Folks have already mentioned issues about critical infrastructure that touches on data flows. We continue to work very assiduously to keep the PRC out of our critical infrastructure, whether that's telecoms, ports, cloud, subsea cables, and continue to work with partners and allies like Japan and Korea, urging others to do the same. One last area in this particular realm, the PRC is also occasionally known for instrumentalizing its overseas researchers. We have a very narrowly targeted visa review program that looks at PRC national post-grad researchers looking to come to the United States, in particularly sensitive S&T fields. For folks that do have ongoing ties to Xi Jinping's military simple fusion program, we take a very close look at those. So that's sort of that traditional first category. And then the second, both of my colleagues here have already mentioned several times, is merely those sectors where we're simply over-dependent on China. Over-dependence on any one source is bad in the best of circumstances, but giving the PRC's penchant for coercing others, as Dr. Suzuki noted, dating back to 2010, and the rare earths embargo against Japan. Obviously, it's incumbent upon us to further diversify these critical supply chains. And here the tool set is a little bit more on the incentivize and encourage line, I would say. And the three big pieces of legislation that President Biden has signed into law, the Bilateral Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and of course the Inflation Reduction Act, those are chock full of incentives to get folks to invest in these critical sectors, whether it's semiconductors or clean technology in the States. But there are also provisions in these laws that seek to encourage participation of our partners and allies in various segments of these supply chains. The ITSE fund under CHIPS comes to mind. Various provisions in the IRA, which encourage FTA partners to provide critical minerals, for example. So there are really both home shoring and friend shoring provisions to those. And of course, the encouragement, Secretary Mondo talked quite a bit about the work on supply chains in the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, of which Australia, Japan, Korea, and the United States are all founding members. My boss back at the State Department has also been very, very involved in this mineral security partnership. Again, same four countries are founding members of that, and transaction by transaction, we're trying to chip away at PRC dominance of critical mineral supply chains around the world. The third area, perhaps the widest, where the arms really start stretching, kind of beyond the elbow, the ability of the elbow ligaments to kind of hold in. But this is the basic, I guess you could almost say garden variety PRC predatory non-market policies and practices that they have been deploying now for decades. A lot of ink was spilt on this at the Leader Summit in Italy just last week by the G7 heads of state. And look, back when China was the #7 economy in the world, or even the #4 economy in the world, that was one thing, but now it's the world's second largest economy. It's massive subsidies, it's ongoing IP theft and forced technology transfer, the massive restrictions on access to its own market. All of these, of course, heavily tilt the playing field in favor of its companies at the expense of US and other non-PRC companies and our workers. And so, unlike in previous administrations where I think, generally speaking, we waited for harm to be done before taking remedial actions, this administration is looking to be a bit more proactive. I think the most obvious tool here is the announcement that the Biden administration just made about raising some of the 301 tariffs on particular products of concern. Legacy semiconductors, steel and aluminum, solar, electric vehicles, and batteries come to mind. So those are the three sort of ways that we bucket this. Again, echoing a lot of the things that have already been said. I will say, in every single one of these areas, we are doing our best to work as closely as we can with our closest partners and allies. Obviously, United Front, you have a much better chance of being successful dealing with as tough a competitor as China. Thanks.
Jonathan, I think you captured in that reply exactly why economic security is so difficult, because the number of issues that you raised, people have to have expertise in import and export controls, researchers coming to their country, rare earth elements, supply chains, and economic coercion. So it's very important to have conferences like this where you bring the right people together to have these discussions, because you can't talk about one without talking about the other. But I'd like to dive deeper into this whole question of industrial policy. Now, we're in Australia, in Sydney, and Australia hasn't had the best track record with industrial policy in the past. And so we have a sort of knee-jerk reaction against industrial policy. But the story is very different in Japan and Korea in particular. And obviously now the US has this far-reaching Inflation Reduction Act. So I wanted to ask a question to all panelists, starting with Suzuki Sensei. How should we view this new enthusiasm for industrial policy? Should we embrace it as providing a net good for economic self-sufficiency? Or is it something that we should accept begrudgingly as a necessary evil needed for national security objectives?
That's a very tough question. I think for many years, Japan has employed the idea of industrial policy as for the national, for the goods of nations. I mean, Japan as a sort of a late modernizer since the late 19th centuries. Japan has, the state played a role to improve the industrialization, and that tradition has went on even after the World War II. So Japan, after the devastation of losing everything during the World War II, the reconstruction was the key element, and the government played a significant role. So traditionally, the idea of industrial policy is accepted as in favor for the national growth, national reconstruction, catching up with the advanced industrialized countries. And I think this has changed, as I said in the podium, that it was not accepted in the free trade world, the globalizing economy. And I think, we gradually, accepted the idea of the market-oriented economy, less government intervention. And now, people start to talk about the industrial policy. So we are not demonizing the industrial policy at all. And we are now restarting redefining, re-embracing the industrial policy by investing heavily on the semiconductor sector in particular, and also some defense sector as well as space. These are the sort of a critical strategic sector that is needed for both the security policy, the security autonomy, since we have been dependent on the Taiwan and the many other countries, so that there is a recognition that because of this 2010 incident, there is a recognition that Japan needs to build certain strategic autonomy. Not in the French sense, but it's more like strategically autonomous in terms of economy, supply chain, and technology. But I think still there are certain skepticism in Japan that the industrial policy may not be successful all the time. And I think from the comparison to United States, I think there is we don't have the sense of competing or beating China. China is a huge neighbor and the source of our wealth. So, trading with China is the basic, necessity for Japanese economy to continue growing and focusing on the strategic sector. So, how to secure the relationship with China is more important than beating China. And I think there is a difference. We are strategic. We define China as a strategic challenges, but not as a competitor. So we are not trying to compete with China and try to be independent totally from China. So that's probably a point that worth mentioning.
Dr. Wong, same question to you.
Yeah. When I just teach the trade theory in my classroom, I just used a number of textbooks, and including the Paul Krugman's textbook. And in the traditional trade theory, how to justify the industrial policy. And probably there are two things. One is one argument for the infant industry protection. It's an older story. But in the recent, the strategic trade theory, we are just trying to justify some kind of subsidies and some kind of government support for the specific industries. We are just focusing on the externality. What is the externality? Because if there is some economies of scale and economies of the externality, then we can justify some kind of a subsidy to specific industry. Because there is some positive externality when the government just provides a subsidy. So I think that is the one argument. So that's the reason why now the WTO, World Trade Organization, is just allowing some kind of the R&D subsidy to the specific the industries. But now when you just talk about the industrial policy, I think the Professor Suzuki mentioned that we must redefine and we must reinvent the concept of the industrial policy, because there is no any kind of the externality. It's very difficult. So if we just have cheap industry, probably there may be some kind of externality. The U.S. just provide a subsidy to attract the TSMC and Samsung and the onshoring from the offshoring companies. Then probably externality, but it's more than the externality. So I think it's kind of the geopolitical competition. Yeah. So I think the geopolitical dimension is much more important than the economics. But we must get back to the basics. So we must be very careful when you just reinvent and redefine the industrial policy. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, industrial policy isn't new, but the way that we are using it now is definitely new. Jonathan, can I turn to you for a US perspective? Should Australians just stop worrying and learn to love industrial policy?
Absolutely. No, look, I think it's right that we're all a little bit skeptical of industrial policy. I don't think this is something that would be a first policy choice of most of the folks in this room. I would argue that industrial policy, even in China, has not been successful, depending on how you look at success. Do they now control more than 50% of global steel production? Yes, they do. That's a success. Has it been a real value add to the standard of living of most Chinese citizens? I would argue almost certainly not. That said, again, we have such a large economy that is engaging in such sort of aggressive industrial policy itself. I think we are basically forced into playing this game by the PRC. And again, this is a Leninist state. They are able to direct not just the government, but state-owned enterprises, the financial sector, ostensibly private sector businesses, the media, they're able to direct pretty much the whole of society to move in directions that Xi Jinping has decided are important. And either we are going to sit by and let them decide which sectors of the 21st century economy they're going to dominate, because if we take no action, that will happen, perhaps at great cost to their own economic fortunes, but that still will have impacts on the rest of us. Or we are, however reluctantly, going to have to pick up the gauntlet and do our best, try to come up with smart policies and find ways to keep our industries and those of our partners and allies in the mix, so that we do have some diversity, we do have some resilience, and are not completely dependent on a power that we know does not necessarily mean us well over the long run.
And Jonathan, can I just push a little further and ask you, can you reflect on what you think might be some of the dangers in terms of tit-for-tat subsidies happening in both the United States and China?
Well, I would go, I would say, I'm more worried about the tit-for-tat subsidies that the United States and our closest partners and allies might be sort of stepping on one another's toes. And I would say that's one area where we've taken great pains diplomatically, through folks at the State Department, the Commerce Department, and elsewhere, to make sure that we are, at least where we know when we are, sort of providing redundant support to our own industries, we are doing a very, very intensive amount of diplomacy, whether it's on the semiconductor front, figuring out where we have our own respective strengths and weaknesses, and where our own government support is going. Same with clean technologies. We're doing this with the Europeans via the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. So there is a lot of very concerted diplomatic effort going into making sure that we are, to the best of our ability, coordinating as best we can on our own support mechanisms for our industries.
Yeah, as you reflected, I mean, China can just direct its industries. Democracies have to do a lot more coordination work, and that sometimes puts us at a disadvantage because of how much of an uplift that is for officials. Suzuki-sensei, can I turn to you for the next question? The next thing I want to talk about is supply chain security and diversification of supply chains. Obviously, this is something that Japan has felt acutely, as you mentioned, with China banning rare earth elements, which Japan depends on. Critical minerals, I like to say, they are critical, and people need them for everything, for clean energy transition to military hardware like jets and drones, to new technologies. I wanted to ask all the panelists, starting with you, about what's standing in the way of Japan diversifying, not just critical minerals, but diversifying its supply chains. And to preempt a follow-up that I want all the panelists to tackle is, how close are our nations, including Australia, to actually pooling our resources, putting some money behind a particular strategic critical input so that we're not doubling and duplicating effort? So, Suzuki.
Well, I think one of the big problems is, for example, when we talk about the critical mineral, the amount of critical minerals and the countries that produces the critical mineral are limited. So yes, it's really difficult for coordinating because there is a competition element. And if some countries trying to secure the supply of the critical mineral, that means it's a minus for the others. So this is pretty much a zero-sum game. And I think this is why we need to have a more intensive coordination to make sure that we can share the same, or we can have the sort of coordinated approaches to the sources of the critical mineral, for example, and to overcome the Chinese strategic network of the supply chain. I think we shall not underestimate the amount of the Chinese investment in the building up the supply chain of the critical mineral. If you go to Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, you try to penetrate in the market and try to contract with mining companies. 100% of the mining companies in DR Congo has one way or another a long-term contract with China. So how to penetrate that? we need to have we need to bring that resources all together and to have a strategy to penetrate into that market and to make sure that there will be a supply. And then we need to have another strategy, or coordinated strategy, to have the refinery processes, because refining process, even though these items are not, these minerals are not produced in China, these are all refined in China. So we need to have another, and these are not a cheap investment. It requires a lot of investment. So we need to work together. So these are to overcome the competitive elements of securing the supply chain, together with the friends and allies.
Dr. Wong.
We already, finished the pillar 2 of the IPEF. The pillar 2 is about the supply chain, and there are two things in the pillar 2 supply chain agreement. One is about crisis resolution. When it just faced some kind of, the shortage and the crisis in the supply chain and the supply chain disruptions, then the member countries just have some emergency call to, resolve the challenges. Then I think that is very important, the movement at the multilateral level, because countries are just trying to share the information about some specific, the materials and the disruptions of the supply chain. And in the normal times, countries are involved trying to, strengthen the supply chain cooperation. So, but I think that will be very, very slow. But so now we have the MSP, so Mineral Strategic Partnership, and also we are trying to develop the strategy to particularly, diversify the source of the minerals. So now that we have a number of projects, but one of the, the successful project is now being done in the Tanzania. And that project is now developed by the Australian mining company, BlackRock Mining, is main developer. And then the POSCO has some stake in that project. And also now the 3 countries from Japan, US, and Korea trying to encourage the involvement of the development bank. So development bank is trying to participate in some stakes beyond the loans. So I think that kind of collaboration will be very, very good for the diversified source of the minerals, particularly in the case of the IRA. The batteries has a very important component. The other one is anode. So the production of making the anode, one of the core component, we need a graphite. But in the graphite, most of the countries rely on graphite from China, 97%. 97%. How to diversify that source of the graphite? Just looking at the 50 years ago, in the 1970s, graphite was the #1 export item in Korea. Because of the environmental reason, many countries just gave up. US gave up in Japan, and no more produced. So now just we have the wake-up call from the IRA. So we need different sources from China, how to diversify. So we just started this kind of venture in Tanzania, and also now the U.S. companies are trying to develop the graphite domestically. So our Korean battery companies like SK and other companies have some alliance with the U.S. the companies, but. Because of the environmental reason, it's very difficult to protect the environment at the same time developing the graphite. So that is a very, very important and sensitive issue. Yeah.
Jonathan, in some senses, you have the hardest job now because you have to follow the last 2 speakers on the same question. So I'm going to make it harder for you. And the question I want to ask is...
Even harder?
How is the United States government ensuring that there'll be policy longevity in terms of things like the Mineral Security Partnership and other policies that are already underway post the election?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, particularly with regards to the Mineral Security Partnership, there is very strong bipartisan support on the Hill, both the Senate and the House sides, for these types of supply chain initiatives. I think everyone recognizes our Energy Resources Bureau's got a couple of great graphs where they go through all of the critical minerals and who controls the mining, who controls the exploitation, and the whole thing is just red, because of course, China's 80, 90, 95% of all of these, nickel, lithium, the 3Gs. And of course, we now have Chinese export controls on graphite, on germanium and gallium, only highlighting how important it is that we start the process at diversification. Again, I am not particularly worried that this would be an issue that will see any dramatic changes regardless of what our election results are in November. I will just say, however, that the great thing about the MSP, I think we're up to maybe 13 or 14 like-minded partners. It allows us to pool our intelligence, but also our various tools. I mean, the United States has some things that we can bring to bear. Korea does as well, so does Australia, so does Japan. Working with our respective private sectors, even in the DRC or Indonesia, folks recognize that China's going to be a player in this sector for years to come. I mean, certainly, we would not deny that. But I think everyone would love to have some other players involved. And so when we're able to pool our resources, get a couple of our companies working together, I think transaction by transaction, deal by deal, we will be able to make some small incremental progress that will grow over time in actually diversifying the critical minerals sector.
You said the D word, and that's deal, and I think that's the magic word for any future administration. So we have run out of time, and I want to make sure that everyone gets a break for morning tea. Please do come back in here at 11, because we'll have Dr. Elizabeth Economy giving a keynote speech at 11 a.m., which you do not want to miss. But can you please join me in thanking our esteemed panel members, Suzuki Sensei, Dr. Wong, and Mr. Fritsch. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.